In this presentation, we will cover government regulation and the logic of red tape. Specifically, we'll define government regulation, we'll discuss some federal regulatory bodies, and some examples of local regulations. We'll also cover the logic of red tape, including defining red tape and discussing its positives and negatives. Government regulation includes government activity designed to monitor and guide private economic competition. Specific actions include placing limits on producers' prices and promoting commerce through grants and subsidies. Government regulation also includes regulating the conditions under which goods and services are produced and attempting to minimize product hazards and risk to consumers. Advocates for free market competition argue that government regulation hurts consumers and producers by interfering with the marketplace. There is certainly a point to be made here. Think about the regulations in place that may prevent someone from starting a business. You may even know someone personally who has had trouble navigating the bureaucracy because of these regulations. Advocates for government regulation see a greater need to monitor and guide the course of competition, though. They believe that completely unrestrained markets will inevitably lead to monopolistic practices, higher costs, underserved segments of society, and lower quality goods and services. Take, for example, someone trying to open a restaurant. An advocate for free market competition may argue that government regulation stands in the way of operating a successful business that contributes to the local economy. However, an advocate for government regulation would argue that standards need to be in place to ensure that customers of that business are served fairly and safely. It is not that one of these views is right or wrong, but that somehow free market competition and government regulation must coexist. Government regulation exists at all levels of government. Here are some examples of federal regulatory bodies. The Consumer Product Safety Commission enforces uniform safety standards for consumer products. The Federal Communication Commission regulates interstate and international radio, television, cable television, and satellite communications. The Food and Drug Administration conducts testing and evaluation programs and sets standards for food, over-the-counter drugs, medical devices, and other substances. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration develops safety and health standards for business and industry, and then monitors compliance and proposes penalties for non-compliance. These are just a few examples of federal regulatory bodies that enforce regulations. Regulations at the local level aim to guide citizen behavior, oftentimes with a focus on local business. Many localities have parking restrictions to help make sure that people are not leaving their cars in front of businesses for extended periods of time. Building permits and zoning issues are of particular importance when discussing local regulations. Zoning regulations determine what type of construction can take place on property in town. So some areas are zoned residential and others commercial. Some may be zoned mixed use with a combination of residential and commercial. Zoning rules help ensure that businesses are located in concentrated areas, separate from residential areas, and help stimulate the local economy by concentrating foot traffic in certain areas. Local governments also have regulations on things like which animals are allowed to be kept as pets and the proper treatment of animals. These are just a few examples of the things that your local governments enforce in whatever town you live in. The issue of regulation is related to the concept of red tape. Red tape is the name of the procedures and rules that must be followed to get something done. The increased need for government services has led to an increase in federal regulations. Red tape, of course, exists across levels of government. It is often unpopular with citizens because it creates a seemingly endless network of policies and procedures that one must follow to get something done. For example, citizens may be frustrated with the amount of paperwork that it takes to open a small business, or the amount of paperwork needed to build a structure on their own property. In my own experience, as a small example of red tape, local red tape, I remember being very frustrated with the city on two separate occasions, two separate cities, actually, because these were at different points in time. The first was when I was required to pay a fee and obtain a permit to build a fence in my backyard. The other was when I had to obtain a permit to build a shed in my backyard. These were separate instances at different homes I owned in the past. On one hand, I thought that it was wrong that I couldn't just build a fence or shed on my own property whenever I wanted. The paperwork involved seemed excessive for something I was doing, again, on my own property. However, on the other hand, these regulations exist not because not everyone has a reasonable plan for their property. I simply wanted to build a 4-foot fence to let my dog run around the backyard. But the regulation and the requirement of a permit makes sure that someone isn't going to build a 40-foot privacy fence next door and block out the sun that kills all the neighbors' grass. Ultimately, the red tape exists for a reason and makes sure that there are standards in the neighborhood. There are certainly some positives and negatives to red tape. Red tape creates inefficiencies in government services as citizens and bureaucrats work to follow the steps that are necessary. The result is a slow-moving government operation that does not effectively adjust to the changing needs of the population. However, red tape helps elected officials control bureaucracy and assures that citizens are treated equally under the law. For example, the Bureau of Motor Vehicles has to collect the same documents to verify any driver's identity in order to renew a driver's license. The paperwork involved may seem burdensome, but the paper trail ensures that all citizens are being held to the same standards. Red tape allows elected officials to document the work of bureaucracy, which is important because bureaucracy doesn't allow for anyone to see the outputs because agencies don't produce anything. While this makes government inefficient, it does help government remain democratically controlled. In this presentation, we covered government regulation and the logic of red tape.